So we're starting with issue 2 now. Does the plan include an appropriate target for accommodation for gypsies and travellers and travelling show people in the district? You'll see there's only a couple of points on my agenda in relation to this, but in light of a recent letter that's come in from an agent representing a group of travelling show people, I did want to raise a couple of additional questions in relation to provision to be made in the plan. First of all, the question of whether this group's been consulted, that sort of thing. If I just leave that with the council to be addressed perhaps outside of the meeting. But perhaps first of all, if the council could just explain to me which evidence the plan relies on, because it's suggested in that letter that it isn't relying upon the latest GTAA. Do you want to? Sure. Sorry.
May I introduce Ms. Karen Moore?
Hello.
Hello, Madam. The letter is mistaken, Madam. The Council is relying on the most recent GTAA, which you find at EB 805.
EB
805.
805. And what's that document?
That is the full title, the summary report of the, apologies, it's a long title, Epping Forest District Council Gypsy Traveller and Travelling Show People Accommodation Assessment Need Summary Report, final version, September 2017. And, sorry, I should add, together with a statistical update provided at EB 402A that the District Council produced. And that is titled Activity on Sites for Traveller and Gypsy Accommodation, Epping Forest District Council, September 2016 to October the 1st, 2017.
Okay, thank you. Could you just summarise the findings of that in relation to travelling show people in particular?
Certainly. In relation to travelling show pitches, there was a finding that 1 yard was required for the planned period. If I may supplement that, there has been some confusion, I think, regarding what the council defines as a yard, and the existing yard, which contains 9 smaller yards, is treated as the existing site that we have looked at, and the plan makes provision for an additional yard for that within that site. So it makes provision for intensification of that site.
So there's one big yard.
There's one
at the
big
moment,
yard.
and the study finds the need for one more small yard within it, is that right?
I'll be frank with you, it isn't as clear as it could be.
Right.
The expectation is that the provision is to intensify the site because there has been recognition both in the GTAA and in the site selection report that there is overcrowding on that site, and the expectation is that the requirement is met within the existing site boundary, but it is allocated within the plan specifically to intensify the use, to deal with the overcrowding. And to be clear, the overcrowding in relation to what it currently has permission for.
So sorry, just to clarify my understanding, so the plan, so the GTAA recognises, it accepts that there's overcrowding on the current site, whatever you describe that as, and that intensification of that site should be made to address that, and that's what the plan intends to do. The plan intends to address that. Okay, so in relation to the specific letter we've received, does the plan intend to address that specific problem that the agent is obviously concerned about?
Yes, yes, madam. I believe that the letter misunderstands the situation.
Okay,
With due respect, and indeed the plan does make the precise provision that the agent is concerned about.
can we just go to the part of the plan that deals with that? Can you, where the allocation is?
Yes.
I just want to make sure that if it seems that everybody's on the same page really, but there's a misunderstanding whether or not the plan is clear on that, or whether the plan could be modified to make it clearer.
P. The policy is P12. Thank you. So page, what's the page number? It is unhelpful. Map 5.22, site allocations in Morton, which follows page 165, a few pages afterwards. Site More.T, More.T1 is the site. And that is the existing Lakeview yard known as Lakeview.
It's,
Okay, so it's policy P12 part C is the
Yes.
actual allocation.
Yes.
So I'll just take the council's view on that. In light of what you've said, is it accurately described there? So this obviously says that Morton T1 is allocated for 1 yard. Is that the correct way to describe what you've explained the intentions of the plan to be?
It might be clearer if we said 1 additional yard, but then that could be confusing too, I guess.
I was just wondering if there's any way of clarifying that it's, you know, that it will address this intensification.
Maybe we should put that in the supporting text.
Yeah, I think some sort of clarification could be, because I mean, you've said by your own standard that there's 1 yard with 9 yards within it. I think if it could be clarified that this would address the concerns that have been raised, that would be helpful. Thank you. If you could consider that would be a main modification. Thank you. Thank you. Did anyone else want to raise anything about that? I think otherwise my questions came specifically from that letter, so I'll think about that, and if I have anything further, if no one else wants to address it, I can deal with it outside of the hearing. Anybody else on that point? No. Thank you. In that case, we'll return to the agenda. Okay, so a potential modifications policy SP2D to clarify the requirements for the plan period. The council has explained that the requirements for the full plan period are 64 gypsy and traveller pictures and 1 travelling show people, site of the nature we've just discussed. The residual requirements, taking account of permissions and completions, is 32 pitches and 1 yard, and the plan actually provides for 38 pitches and 1 yard. The Council agrees that the requirements for the full plan period should be set out in Policy SP2D and has proposed an amendment accordingly, and that's to reflect the need for the plan period in the same way that housing is reflected. Does anyone have any comments, concerns about that? No? Okay, so if we can record that as a modification. Just something to point out perhaps for a later hearing. I note that there's a statement on behalf of landowner LAD 0034 has questioned the deliverability of the site NWB T1 within the timescales assumed in the trajectory. We'll pick that up under matter 6. So can you just make sure you look at that for matter 6. Thank you. And then the second point on the agenda relates to those who don't meet the definition of gypsies and travellers in the PPTS. And the council proposes to deal with applications by these people who need to live in a caravan but who don't meet the definition on a case-by-case basis, having regard to policy H1C. Does anyone have any concerns about that proposal in principle? No. If we just turn to H1C for a moment. Find it. 57, thank you. Okay, so H1C states that proposals for sites upon which caravans can be stationed will be supported where they meet a proven identified needs, and that's part I of that policy. And my question was just simply, how will applicants satisfy this requirement if their needs haven't been identified as part of the evidence base?
Excuse me. I think it's fair to say, although not directly identified in the evidence base, the potential need, if I can put it like that, is identified through the GTAA insofar as there was uncertainty in that part of the evidence base as to whether or not some of those persons or households who are presently living in caravans within the district met the planning definition for gypsies and travellers. The GTAA identifies that an element of those whose status, and what I mean by status is whether or not they're travellers for the purposes of the PPTS, an element of those unknown, whose status is unknown, will generate future housing need, but it is impossible at the plan-making stage to identify whether or not they will have a need for traveller site development or a need for land upon which to station a caravan for residential use. National planning policy in PPTS was, as we know, revised in August of 2015 to alter, and some would say tighten, the definition of traveller to those who have a nomadic habit of life, and that has a particular meaning in law, and have not ceased travelling permanently. In the context of this being a Greenbelt authority, or an area, a local planning authority area that is covered by a Greenbelt, it is very likely that new traveller site development will be provided in the Greenbelt, and that reflects our allocations. Whether or not need for accommodation in caravans should be provided over the planned period to meet needs and provided in the Greenbelt will always depend upon the status of the person applying. and not to put too fine a point on it, the reality of the situation in this district is that there are more likely to be people living in caravans that are ethnic gypsies or travellers than are not. This is not a Park Homes type authority, if I can put it that way. So it will always be a question of evidence and for the determination at the application stage to identify whether or not the person is actually applying for planning permission for traveller side development or something different. And there is no way, in my respectful submission, to be more clear about that at this stage, given the reality that it requires the individuals involved to demonstrate status as travellers, so as to identify how their needs would be met. It cannot be right for us to allocate land for what would otherwise look like and have the character of traveller site development for persons who do not qualify as travellers for the purposes of the national policy definition. Therefore, it will be necessary at the determination stage to identify whether or not a need exists, but we accept that will always be our responsibility to demonstrate as the local planning authority, because no person who is applying for planning permission for housing needs to demonstrate that there is a need for a general need for housing in the district. So it will always be incumbent upon the local planning authority to demonstrate whether or not there is a need. So to that extent, I think we accept, or certainly wouldn't object to, that policy, the policy requirement at H1C1 as being perhaps qualified by some supporting text that makes it very clear that it's the responsibility of the local planning authority to demonstrate that there is a need for the development. I say that because to do otherwise would be to potentially discriminate against persons who are of a particular ethnic origin or background. It's a complicated situation, but it's undoubtedly the case that the type of development or that for which planning permission will be sought to meet any needs arising from this population will be in the Greenbelt. So therefore it will be incumbent upon the applicant to demonstrate very special circumstances, but not incumbent upon them to demonstrate that there is a housing need generally in the district. I know that's a long and convoluted answer, but insofar as there is a difference in policy, an apparent difference in policy indicating that one type of housing dweller, or a dweller in one type of housing, should have a more onerous responsibility to demonstrate, to secure planning permission. That's certainly not the intention.
Okay. Thank you. Anyone else? No. Thank you. Okay, we'll leave that there then. So we'll move on to issue 3. Oh, a couple of minutes. That's fine.
Switch around.
That's fine. Okay, Mr. Beard, did you want to introduce your new colleagues? That's okay.
Thank you very much, Madam. This afternoon, to my right is David Coleman, Planning Policy Manager here at the Council. To his right, Mr. Stuart Hardesty from Hardesty Jones Associates, who's assisted us with the FEMA work. And to his right is Ms. Vicky Willis, who's a member of the Planning Policy team.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so my first question on the agenda is whether the I'll just read out issue 3. Is the functional economic market area, the FEMA, upon which the plan is based, appropriately defined, and are the requirements for job growth and employment land set out in the plan justified? Some of my questions are really around clarity for me, although I know there are other issues that people want to raise. But my first question is, has the FEMA been drawn too narrowly to take full account of the need for new industrial land, particularly for warehousing? This is a question that was raised by a particular respondent, Paragon Northweald. I just wondered if you could address that point.
Yes, in terms of your question, EB 610, which is the FEMA-wide assessment of requirements for employment land, has taken account of all growth in industrial and warehousing sectors in terms of net growth, but also identifies the need to provide additional supply, which is listed as replacement, but to ensure that there is a full account is taken for upgrading stock and replacing any losses which may occur for a range of reasons, including no longer fit for purpose. The growth scenarios tested not only include the baseline growth, which comes from the East of England forecasting model, but also a range of local uplift factors, which ensure that full account is taken of known growth drivers that were not fully reflected in the baseline scenarios. So our view is that it does take fully account for all growth.
I think the point, from memory, I think the points that might have been made is whether or not it takes account of any requirements perhaps coming from the wider London area.
We would make a similar point to that which was made this morning under housing. So the FEMA-wide study, again, was approved by the Co-op Board, which included representation from the London boroughs. So they have been engaged in the study, and they were updated throughout the life of the study on emerging findings and approving the final report. And there was no indication of any unmet need arriving from the London area in terms of industrial and warehousing requirements.
Thank you. Did anyone else want to raise anything about the composition of the FEMA? Sorry.
Yes, thank you. I think this is in response to what we submitted to you on behalf of Paragon. I think my difficulty here is your original question asked about how the FEMA had been defined. Now, the PPG gives us guidance on how to define a FEMA as it does for a housing market area. And what we gave you in our statement was a checklist against the guidance from the planning policy guidance, a checklist. And essentially, none of the steps that were required to define a FEMA appear to have been followed. When you follow the analysis in the Hardesty Jones report, most of the time the consultants outside of the PPG conclude that they're not relevant. Now, it isn't for me or you or the consultants to decide that the PPG is not relevant or it isn't helpful. there's a process to be followed. And I think what we were setting out was that that process clearly had not been followed in this instance, and the FEMA had not actually been defined according to the guidance. I think I made a specific reference to you for the recent Enfield Employment Land Review, which explicitly reaches a different conclusion about the extent of their FEMA, and they include Epping Forest within their FEMA. So they've gone through a process of identifying a FEMA and worked out a difference. And I haven't heard or seen an answer as to where the steps required in the PPG have been undertaken.
I think the concept of identifying FEMAs is by nature complex, and the guidance says that there is no one particular way, and does note a range of evidence that one might look to identify that. It's also important to understand why a FEMA is being defined, and in this case it's to be able to inform effective planning policy. I think it is fair to say that Epping Forest District is subject to a range of influences and is in some ways a complex FEMA, and I believe that the research reflects that. And in terms of the descriptions and the maps as set out, and the references are all set out in our hearing statement to this effect, notes that the boundaries are fuzzy and there are a range of influences from outside the FEMA. Any FEMA as defined, and one has to draw a line at some point to be able to plan pragmatically and to make to undertake the necessary assessments, is to some extent interrelated with its neighbouring areas, and that is true of the West Essex and East Hertfordshire FEMA, insofar as there are influences to the north with Cambridge, there are influences to the south with London in terms of both travel to work into central London and the North London boroughs. And all of that is reflected in the analysis and the way that the FEMA is drawn. Now, again, for the purposes of the assessment that we needed to make, we needed to be able to test the balance of labour market in terms of demand and supply, and therefore there was a strong rationale for giving substantial weight to the HMA and the analysis that was being undertaken on a demographic basis to be able to say, is there a balance of labour demand and supply in the assessment? So that is very much taken account of. As we've said, there is clearly a interrelationship with North London boroughs and the southern part of Epping Forest District, and the North London boroughs have been participating in the co-op board, as I said. So there has been engagement on a regular basis with those authorities to understand whether there is unmet need.
Back, sorry, have we seen you before?
No, you haven't. I'm Andrew Poulton from Pegasus Group, representing Martin Grant Homes and Harcourt Developments.
Thank you.
We've made our hearing statements already, and I just want to sort of echo a little bit what the colleague to my left has said. Our principal problem with the FEMA area is that it doesn't actually reflect economic geographies. And Mr. Jones just said it's complicated. It is complicated because it doesn't reflect those geographies. It's unduly influenced by key economic centres that aren't within it, and it doesn't have any key economic centres of its own, with the possible exception of Harlow. And this is really at the heart of all the problems that we're going to face and that we're going to talk about going forward. Now, I'm not suggesting that, I don't suppose it's appropriate to change it now, but I think it is important to understand what's at the heart of this, which heart of the problems that we have here, and the difficulties that we have here, and it is to do with this area, which is so dependent on key centres outside it, not just Cambridge and London, but you've also got Chelmsford, you've also got Stevenage. It's actually being pulled in 4 directions, and you've got travel to work areas all around it. So it's because of this that it's such a complicated, it is a complicated area, and it presents all these issues that we have been talking about and that we'll go on talking about.
Further.
One could continually extend functional economic market areas to take the next area of influence to the point where they would become vast. So if one were to just hypothetically, include Stevenage, what you would then look to areas to the west of Stevenage, for example. So one has to come to a basis on which one can effectively plan and take account of influences in neighbouring areas, which is what has been sought to be done here. So all of the analysis has taken account of the relationships that go beyond the boundary of the FEMAs in terms of taking account of likely commuting patterns and how they may change, in terms of engagement with those authorities, in terms of unmet needs and such like. So as I come back to the point that you have to come to a basis on which you can undertake the assessments and then make sure that you're taking account of issues around the fringes, which we would suggest that we have done.
Can you just comment specifically on the point about the PPG and how you haven't, is it the case you've ignored the PPG, or have you looked at the factors and reached a view?
We've looked at the factors and reached a view. So just looking at the table to pick some, for example, there's reference to the LEP geography, and the objector has said the analysis suggests the FEMA is larger and does not support the FEMA as defined. Well, the LEP geography extends to the wider, much of the wider southeast, south of London, including Dover, for example. So it's very large, but it doesn't, out of interest, include London. We've talked about travel to work areas, and there clearly are influences to other locations, but what we have done is taken account of commuting patterns to those areas. Housing market area we've discussed. So we have looked at those. Clearly it is, as we've already said, it's complex. We've looked at available information on those and come to what we believe is a pragmatic basis for developing an assessment and a plan and taking account of factors and influences from outside and noting that the boundaries are fuzzy and there are other influencing locations.
Thank you. Can we take a last point from Mr. Pestel on this, and then we'll move on?
Yes, thank you. I won't repeat what's already done in our tables and our analysis. I'd just point out, and we'll come on to this in a minute, we keep hearing the word fuzzy. Now, the word fuzzy is essentially we haven't quite got it right, and we know the geography is not right. Now, if the geography is fuzzy, the quantitative analysis that we'll come on to talk to in a minute makes absolutely no allowance for that fuzzy nature, because the FEMA, once it was defined, never poked its head above that parapet. So to rely on fuzziness is not really a way of getting out the MPPF and PPG. And as I think we say, a lot of the indicators which are given in the PPG do result in a larger FEMA, because a larger economic area influences demand here, but we just don't do that.
Mr. Coleman.
Thank you, Madam. I just thought it would be useful to make one further point, which is set out in our hearing statement, paragraph 24, page 14. Just to remind you that this issue was considered at the East Herts district plan examination, and the inspector there did conclude that the strategy for employment had been positively prepared, and that the FEMA authorities have worked together through the duty to cooperate to identify need and apportion on the required land across the market area. So in a sense, she gave her blessing to the same work that we're discussing here and the identification of the same area.
Thank you. We'll move on down the agenda, and essentially I just want to be helped with some clarity over what the job growth and floor space requirements for the plan are and from which evidence they're derived. I think I know what they are, but it would be helpful if someone could just take me through that. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. So the job growth and employment land requirements for the plan are set out in paragraphs 2.48 to 2.52 of the plan. That's on page 25 in the supporting text. Specifically, in terms of job growth, the plan sets out a requirement to provide 10,800 jobs from 2011 to 2033, with some 7,900 of that requirement relating to the 2016 to 2033 period. That's paragraph 2.51 in the plan. Just by way of further detail, paragraph 34 of our matter-free hearing statement also proposes a modification to insert the job requirement into policy SP2, as you'll be aware, and to make sure that that's clearly set out in policy. The job growth requirement comprises both B-use class and non-B-use class employment. I think it's worth clarifying that. And in terms of space requirement, in terms of B-use class employment requirements, there is a requirement for between 2 to 5 hectares of land for new office use and 14 hectares for industrial use for the period 2016 to 2033. Thank you. Apologies, it might be helpful as well just to give you the references for the evidence for that. There are 3 main sources of evidence which the Council has drawn upon to identify those requirements. The first is the West Essex and East Herts Assessment of Employment Needs 2017, and that's EB 610. That's the FEMA work. The second is the Epping Forest District Local Plan Employment Land Supply Assessment, also 2017, and that's EB 602. And then lastly, the Employment Review 2017, which essentially brings together the supply and the demand, and that's EB 603.
Just going back briefly to the floor space requirements, the 2.5 hectare, 2 to 5 hectares and 14, what period is that for? Is that for the whole plan period or the 2016 to 33?
That's for 2016 to 33.
Thank you. I'll ask my couple of questions for clarification, if that's okay, and then we'll move on. So the Council's referred to taking account of an additional requirement for 2,100 jobs. I don't understand what that is. If you could just explain what that is.
Okay, sorry. So the FEMA work, which is EB 610, figure 3.7, identifies a preferred scenario for the distribution of employment across the FEMA area. And that preferred scenario would theoretically result in a level of employment provision which is marginally short of the level required to balance the labour market. And that shortfall is approximately 2,100 jobs. As indicated in the study, EB 610, the FEMA work, on pages 3 to 4, it acknowledges the shortfall, but explains that given that there are uncertainties associated with job forecasting and the long-term nature of local plans, the scale of additional provision over the entire FEMA area up to 2033 does not represent any significant short-term difficulties for local plans. And in reality, that additional provision would be met either through increased job densities on sites and or through windfall development. Equally, the four FEMA authorities that have worked together to produce the study have signalled their commitment to work together in the future and to ensure that that shortfall is accommodated. And that's been agreed through a memorandum of understanding on the distribution of employment needs across the FEMA. That's EB 1203. In reality, the relevance of the additional requirement is considered to be negligible by the Council, not least because the emerging local plans in the FEMA area do provide for flexibility in their employment land requirements, which will counter the shortfall. So, for instance, the local plan submission version under examination provides for 23 hectares of additional employment land against a requirement for up to 19 hectares. So we would consider that essentially that shortfall has already been addressed in this local plan and other local plans. Thank you.
Thank you. And what's the council's understanding of the? I've read a few things about it that have criticised the moderations that have been made to the baseline figures from the forecasting model. If you could just explain what that means, what the criticisms are, and whether if you have made any adjustments, they're justified.
I'll ask Mr. Hardesty to answer.
Thank you.
Okay, as I understand it, there's some concern as to whether creating a moderated position using two versions of the EFM is appropriate and why the 2016 version wasn't relied upon. When we were undertaking this study and analysing the 2016 EFM, it became immediately apparent that there was a significantly different distribution of employment across the four FEMA authorities to that within the previous version, which required some further detailed investigation. At the same time, we engaged with the Cambridgeshire Insight team that managed the East of England forecasting model, who in turn were in touch with Cambridge Econometrics, who prepared the 2016 East of England forecasting model, to explore why there had been such a significant change and whether that was valid. It became appropriate, and we submitted this in our hearing statement and it's set out in EB 610, that there were 2 years of employment data released by the ONS, that's the data for 2013 and 2014, which informed the 2016 edition of EFM, apologies for the many references there, which suggested there had been rapid growth in employment in East Herts and not in any of the other localities within districts within the FEMA. Now that was out of line with local understanding of what had happened. At the point that we were undertaking the research, there was also new data from the ONS available for 2015, which suggested that that unusual pattern of high growth in East Hertfordshire had been somewhat offset, and the balance between the four authorities, which was more akin to its long-term trend, had been returned to, and the analysis is all set out within EB 610. On that basis, it was deemed appropriate to come up with a more balanced distribution of employment around the FEMA for a number of reasons, not least because there appeared to be a technical anomaly, but also in line with various policy ambitions and historic distribution of growth, and particularly issues around Harlow. So on that basis, we developed the moderated baseline. I think the other important point to make is if we hadn't undertaken a moderated baseline, the employment growth for Epping Forest District would have been fewer than 5,000 additional jobs over the entire period 2011 to 33, which...
Just pause a bit. So if you do, so using using the original 2016
16.
version, the job growth would have been markedly lower.
Would have been markedly lower. So that would have been 5,000. Through the moderated baseline, that increased to 9,800. And then through the additional uplifts that were applied within EB 610, that increased further to 10,800 over the 2011 to 33 period.
Sorry, carry on.
I think that was all I was going to say, just that the process of moderation and an adjustment actually came to a much more plausible figure for Epping Forest District.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Young.
Thank you. I'll first of all say I'm not a planner, I'm a chartered accountant. And it's this issue that brought me into the discussions about the local plan. As an accountant, I should at least be good with figures. I refer to the second arrow point, the 2,100 deficit, which was taken from a Hardisty-Jones report issued about the same time that the plan was issued, and it covers the entire FEMA area. But it incorporated a suggestion that 10,000 extra jobs would be created at the airport. Now, Hardisty-Jones were not asked to check this figure. It was a figure agreed by the local authorities. They were not asked, they didn't address it, they were told to accept the assumption. Now, first of all, I should point out that the airport actually is in Attlesford narrowly, but in fact only 18% of the employees at the airport actually live in Attlesford. Most are attracted from surrounding areas. Since I thought this figure was very high, and that's what first got me involved. In fact, since that date, we've had an application from the airport for increased passenger numbers. And they have said that if they get permission, it will create 6,000 extra jobs, not 10,000, over the planned period. Without that permission, they will create 3,000 jobs, again, not 10,000 jobs over the period. The planning permission has not yet been granted. The local authority has given it, but the minister is now looking at calling it in, and there's also a judicial review in train should the minister decide not to call it in. So the position is that if they get planning permission, there'll be a deficit of about 4,000 on top of the 2,000, a deficit of 6,000. If they don't get permission, which they haven't got at the moment, the additional deficit is 7,000, which gets you to 9,000 deficit. And even if they do get it, it's dependent upon passenger numbers increasing in line with their forecasts, which are notoriously optimistic. But there's another point about job creation. The airport is renowned for wildly optimistic projections of employment growth, wildly. And those figures I've quoted are based on that. So across the FEMA area, you're looking at a minimum deficit of jobs of 6,000, and in reality, much more, probably in the area 8 to maybe, I think, perhaps 10,000. And I think this factor has to be taken into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you. Perhaps I could ask Mr. Hardisty to respond on that specific point before we move on to Mr. Austin-Fell.
Yes. The assumptions that were made in our report were based on particular analysis undertaken by Oxford Economics on the economic impact of Stansted. So we didn't come to those conclusions ourselves in terms of the number of jobs that would be created. It's also true that not all of those jobs are necessarily directly related to the airport and its own operations, but to other activities surrounding the airport and in the vicinity. So it's not only the airport operator's own employment that is associated with it, but we've cited in EB 610 footnote 15 the source of the evidence on which we relied in making that assertion.
if what Mr. Young is suggesting comes to pass, what would be the implications of a larger deficit? I mean, how much you suggest that the deficit of 2,100 was quite negligible and could be easily absorbed by other factors within the HMA. How much flexibility is there within the figures that are being planned for in Epping Forest and more widely?
Well, a number of points. In terms of the jobs coming forward, there is some offsetting effect. So the deficit would be unlikely to be that large. So in some of the modelling of the impact of Stansted, that assumes that other jobs that would otherwise come forward can't come forward because there's some displacement of labour supply. So the deficit probably wouldn't be that great. As Mr. Coleman already identified, there is some additional capacity being provided in the local plans across the FEMA, and within the plan that you're currently examining, as was noted, there's 23 hectares against a figure of up to 19 hectares. That was, I think the research identified a range of 16 to 19. So when you look at that across the piece, there is additional capacity built in, which could accommodate further B-use class employment if it required, as well as capacity that's being made available around Stansted, even if that it wasn't directly related to Stansted operations.
Could I just reiterate that my figures are taken from the airport's own planning application?
Thank you, ma'am. I feel a bit of a black sheep in this particular session because whilst I'm here to talk about job numbers, it's in the context of how you arrive at the overall housing need rather than the employment forecasts of land that will be needed. Just in that context, ma'am, I take you to sort of paragraph 2A18 of the PPG, which quite clearly advises that plan makers should make an assessment of the likely change in job numbers based on past trends and or forecasts. And so it's necessary when we're taking those steps in the calculation of OAN that we consider what the impact of job growth will be. Now, the Council's 2017 SHMA and the SHMAs before it have incorporated job growth figures derived from the EFM, the East of England Forecasting Model, which is a bespoke set of data forecasts, particularly for this sub-region. And our concern really is how those have informed the OAN and whether the Council have given due consideration to whether or not these figures are robust and whether other figures may be available. In this context, ma'am, I take you to figure 3.1 of Appendix A of our statement, where due to the benefit of the transparency of this information, it is all available online. So we've been able to chart the historic EFM forecasts against the latest forecast and also benchmark that against data from NOMIS, who are an independent sort of body responsible for capturing labour force data. And what this information tells us is that from 2015 onwards, all the job forecasts under EFM, although perhaps they're at different rates, they all flatline going forward. So from this period onwards, we can expect very little employment growth to occur. And it's whether or not, for the purposes of defining the OAN, as I come back to, that is appropriate, and whether or not the Council need to consider other forecasts in the determination of the robust set of evidence. Now, what we've looked at as part of our exercise is we've looked at the data that's derived from NOMIS, and that looks at the past 16 years from 2000 to 2016. And that tells us that over this period, job growth increased by around 12,000 jobs. That's a growth rate of 1.46%. And when you compare that against the Council's job growth rate of 0.6%, we considered their assessment to be wholly conservative and unrealistic for the purposes of setting OAN. Following that through, ma'am, again, I don't want to labour this point, we have been over it extensively this morning, but following those that data through, once you input that job growth figure from NOMIS, which we consider a more realistic figure, with different variables such as economic activity, commuting rates, etc., that actually takes our economic-led OAN to a figure of 857 dwellings per annum. But conversely, along with that, our figures suggest that if you increase the demographic baseline to account for market signals, you get to a figure of 886 dwellings per annum. So that gives it an indication of the synergy between the two sets of numbers, which not only gives a certain degree of confidence that the market signals figure is meeting the employment need and therefore satisfying the need for the PPG, but it also tells us that there is a certain level of relationship between the two that you can take confidence in on. So, as I said, I'm sitting perhaps in the wrong session here for this, but it's just trying to establish whether or not the council have considered all reasonable employment figures on the table when they've considered the OAN. Thank you.
With regard to the alignment between, between jobs and workers, the original SHMA from 2015 sets out, so that is EB 405, page 89, sets out that we did take account of the EFM outputs, but fundamentally we relied on the evidence that was prepared by Hardesty Jones Associates, so by Mr. Hardesty. Based on a growth of 41,700 additional jobs, which was quite notably higher than the number of jobs in the EEFM. Now, within the original SHMA, we did identify that there would be a shortfall of workers, and we proposed the uplift that we talked about this morning to address that. Within the 2017 SHMA, we concluded that there was alignment between the number of jobs that we were working with, which is the same number of jobs we previously sought to align to, and the baseline demographic projection, and therefore the additional 14% uplift in response to market signals. Now, some of that was going to generate additional population, and that additional population would increase additional workers. So aside from being able to align with the baseline projection, we had additional workers that will be yielded through the uplift. So there would be a surplus of workers based upon the proposed OAN when compared to the number of jobs. In terms of the validity of the number of jobs, evidently that isn't a number that we came up with. That's the number that we were working with from HJA. And that was informed by EFM, but with specific adjustments. If you want to.
Sorry, can I just make sure I've understood? Because obviously it seems that Mr. Austin Fell is suggesting that he didn't take account of the EEFM, but I think what you were saying was that the figures that you have come up with were higher than those in any case. Is that correct?
Yes, if I could just make a few comments on the point about employment numbers. Yes, past trends is one of the factors. Indeed, past trends is obviously a key influencer within the EEFM in terms of its, but not the sole driver of that. And again, we've also looked at past trends in other ways in the analysis, particularly in terms of historical levels of development activity. The other point in terms of future growth looking like a flat line, clearly the reality is likely to be much more uneven, and the outturn graph will look much more like a zigzag, but that will include periods of growth and decline. And as yet we've failed to master the avoidance of recessions and periods of decline. So that long-term averaging does necessarily look rather flatter than anyone would expect reality to be. In terms of the other point to make is we looked at a FEMA-wide assessment. I had a quick look at some of the numbers in the lunchtime period. I don't know have the ONS comparisons to hand, but actually looking across the FEMA-wide assessment with all the uplifts that we've applied, which was actually fueled largely by bringing it into balance with excess labour supply, would be 1.2% per annum employment growth. Now, whilst the figure for Epping Forest District is slightly lower. My calculation was 0.8% per annum. That is, to some extent, driven by the opportunities of where the employment may occur, with a number of activities related to Harlow and related to Stansted Airport. The other thing, I would just be slightly cautious about relying on data from NOMIS from 2000 to 2016, just that there are a range of employment data sets, and there have been quite substantial changes and revisions to definitions over that period, which mean that it's not always simple to come up with a consistent trend. Now, I haven't looked at my colleague's analysis in detail, but I would want to do so before I'd endorse that as a robust assessment of past trends as well.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. I think we're sort of getting, I think it's really important to explore a bit more this 2,100 figure that you referenced and the provenance of that, because what that originates from is actually a deficit of a need for 20,000 jobs. This is outlined in EB 603 in paragraph 3, section 3.3, and it derives from a labour supply excess as a result of the OAN update of 20,000 jobs, not 2,100. And what the evidence then does is look for other jobs, look for where other jobs can come in to take up that 20,000. That's where the Stansted numbers come from. There's also numbers for Harlow Enterprise Zone and for Public Health England to try and make up that 20,000 deficit. And when that exercise is complete, then you've got the 2,100 number. And that's where that comes from. So, but what it's important to understand, therefore, is that all this is based on the moderated baseline. And so there's a huge amount of guesswork going on here. And if any of these grand plans for Stansted or Harlow don't come forward or run into problems, then all these numbers are just up in the air, and they're just simply not robust. And as for the moderated baseline, I don't know if Mr. Jones mentioned Cambridgeshire Insight, but I don't know if the people who actually produced the EEFM have given their blessing. The economic modellers, therefore, Oxford Economics, Cambridge Econometrics, have given their blessing to the method that was used to make that alteration. We don't know that, and there's no suggestion in any of the reports that that's the case. And then what I would add to that is that subsequent to all this, we've had another EFM update for 2017, and that is wildly different. That requires that produces a further 7,000. I say wildly, but substantially a further 7,000 or 8,000 jobs forecast for the FEMA area in the 2017 update over the moderated baseline. So I think that sounds like a lot of information to digest, but I think the point is this is just based on a house of cards, in my view.
And so what would you see the solution being for these figures? Are sort of unknown, it's difficult to assess what needs to happen to make that.
I think a much more robust process is needed. I think the principle of the moderated baseline is fine in terms of looking at distributing the jobs, but I think more evidence and a more robust approach is needed to come up with those numbers. I don't think there's enough. There's not enough evidence to show that they are suitable.
Thank you. Just developing on that very slightly, I don't think I have any problem with a moderated baseline from a forecast. It's fairly common to do it when you look at it. It has been done incredibly crudely here. In fact, I think the only thing that's happened is some random numbers have been added on top of a forecast to be crude and very simple. That appears to be what's happened. Now, the problem with that is, of course, it is only projects which are known today at this moment in time. Now, the plan has to manage that uncertainty going forwards. It's no good just putting in today's schemes, because tomorrow there will be another scheme and the day after there will be another scheme. So I think it's just been done very, very crudely. It could have been done better. And I think to give you some guidance as to how it should have been done, if we go back to the planning policy guidance, which should have set out what the evidence does, it quite clearly at paragraph 32 of section 2A of the old PPG provides us with a list of steps that should have been followed to arrive at an employment land requirement, separate to the jobs argument that goes into the OAN. That's a different bit of the PPG. But paragraph 32 is quite explicit that we can use sectoral and employment forecast projections, labour demand, demographically derived assessments of future needs, but analysis based on past take-up of employment, land and property and or future property requirements, and then consultation. Now, it's quite clear from EB 600, and you can see from figure 4.2 that what has been used here is solely forecasts. It's set out in a very nice flow diagram provided by the consultants to us, and it's quite clear that that is not what the PPG says. Now, the practical problem with this is that I heard earlier that the answer was plausible. Now, I understand we will come on to sites later, but to test how plausible the results of this analysis is, it is just worth noting that one of the 2 employment land allocations in the borough has already been taken up even before it's allocated. The site at Waltham Abbey, the 10-hectare site, which is I had its reference, but you'll come on to it. That site, 10 hectares, more or less half of the industrial land supply in the borough, is currently under pre-let to Next, with the rest of that development to be built out speculatively. So as far as plausibility in the answer goes, it clearly is not plausible. The approach has not given us a plausible answer if before the plan has even been examined, the land supply has been optioned and there is a planning application at the council. I understand, I don't know if it's been determined yet, but there is a current planning application for that site. So in our statement, and I won't reiterate it, but for certain land uses, and especially logistics, the approach taken by the employment land here is simply not robust, and it is not following best practice, nor is it following what the PPG says or what the GLA say.
Thank you. Can we move on, because that takes us nicely onto the land allocation and the total floor space. So the figures that you pointed out earlier, which are set out in paragraph 2.51 of the plan, so 2 to 5 hectares and 14 hectares for new industrial uses. Is that new land? Is that the new land, or does that doesn't take account of the, because we'll come on to this this figure of some of it being from regeneration. Could you just clarify how much is how much floor space is new land and how much is regeneration?
So the up to 19 hectares is for new land, essentially. And so the allocations in the plan go towards what exceed the 19 hectares that's required.
So, sorry, Mum, I don't mean to butt in. I only have one more point to make, then I can shut up for the rest of the day.
Okay.
It was just sort of, again, coming back to the OEN matters related to employment and building upon Mr. Hardsady's kind of comments about the volatility of projections. And that's something I very much agree with. On a year-by-year basis, it's very difficult to understand the change. And it's very explicit when we look at the EAFM forecasts. The last 3 that have been produced show ranges between 0.3 and 0.9% growth. And those forecasts themselves are based on historical trends that have seen between 1 and 2.5% growth. So in very simple terms, ma'am, the only question I really have to put across is whether or not it's realistic to expect that Epping Forest will deliver less employment growth in the future than it has done in the past. Thank you.
Mr. Young.
Yes, I'm sorry, I don't wish to labour the point, but just a couple of points occurred to me. The figure of 10,000 jobs at Stansted Airport, as far as I'm aware, relates to on-site jobs. Oxford Economics was mentioned. I wouldn't like to take their name in vain, but they did do a very detailed analysis on jobs at Stansted, and working on their projections, it would come out at 5,000 jobs. That's without any expansion above the existing permissions. So what we have is, we have a direct comparison between 10,000 and the 3,000 that the airport said it would create without permission, which it hasn't got yet, or 6,000, which it would get, which it claims it would get. Both of those figures are, of course, optimistic. As regards jobs created outside the airport, they can be anywhere. They could be anywhere in the country. In fact, they could be anywhere in the world. But, of course, reducing the on-site employment figures will, in fact, reduce them as well. Thank you. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Hardesty, do you want to respond to any of those points?
If I could just respond to the point in relation to PPG paragraph 2A32 in terms of needing to take account of labour demand, labour supply, and past trends and such like. Our approach is very much based around that. Clearly the EFM and looking at labour demand was the starting point, as we've discussed at some length this afternoon. Secondly, the labour supply and the work of the SHMA was the second point, which identified that labour demand based on the moderated baseline and either of the 2014 or 2016 EFM editions, or for that matter 2017, is insufficient to meet the labour demand that was identified through the demographic work. And without some form of uplift on top of that, there would be, in all likelihood, the conditions to further exacerbate out-commuting from the FEMA to other locations, wherever they may be. As a result, there was a need to consider whether there was a reasonable basis that additional employment and labour demand might emerge across the FEMA. In that investigation, yes, we acknowledge that there are other developments that are not yet known, but the PHE, Public Health England investment was already announced and was in train and being put into practice. There was evidence around growth of Stansted, and there's long-standing evidence and work going on to develop the Harlow Enterprise Zone. So there was a reasonable basis, and ultimately, whilst we don't know exactly the businesses or the employers that might fuel that growth, neither do we for the moderated baseline, that is clearly likely to drive demand. In terms of looking at past trends and past trends of take-up, if I could take you to EB 610, page 33, and there's figure 4.10, where we actually use past trends as a cross-reference or a checkpoint on the analysis that we've identified. So we identified a range of requirement from across the FEMA, and we've then looked at past trends and how that fits with that. And that shows that there is a good triangulation between what has happened in the past and what we're forecasting in the future. On other matters, I'll pass to Mr. Coleman.
I didn't have much more to add, Madam, other than just to clarify. Oh, sorry. In terms of the quantum of requirements, table 2.5 on page 30 of the plan has a summary table which just sets out what the residual requirements are and how they're composed, confirming that the remaining requirement is for between 16 to 19 hectares. And then clearly we'll come on to this another day, but the actual allocations to meet that requirement are in table 3.1, which is on page 65 of the plan. And that shows 5 sites, not the 2 sites that were referred to earlier, but 5 sites to meet the and
Sorry,
exceed
which
them.
table, which page of the plan?
Sorry, page 65. It shows 5 sites which will add up to 23 hectares of land. In addition to that, the policies, and particularly policy E1, provide for the redevelopment and regeneration of existing sites, and also the strategic policies in various places make clear that employment provision will be made for within strategic sites, as well as the site allocations here, but the amount of space in those strategic site allocations is not quantified in the plan. It's likely to be small-scale employment uses within local centres. So there is a 23 hectares plus other uses accounted for within the plan.
Thank you. Just something I wanted to be clear on. So the 23 hectares that's allocated is new land. Obviously, that's intended to go some way towards to providing the 10,000 or so jobs. Is that correct? How much reliance is there on the regeneration of existing sites to provide those jobs? Is it possible to quantify between the two how much regeneration land will provide how many jobs and how much new land?
Not necessarily in terms of the quantity of land, but we consider that 40% of the completions required will come from the reuse and regeneration of existing sites.
That's the completions required to provide the job requirement over the plan period.
That's correct, yeah. And the evidence for that is drawn from the FEMA study, EB 610. And as you've just heard from Mr. Hardesty, that's also based on an analysis of historic and recent completions in the district. We set this out in our hearing statement in paragraph 43. And that goes on to expand further to say, to quantify that, that in absolute terms, the requirement equates to, this is a requirement for the regeneration and reuse of existing sites, equates to 2,790 square metres per annum, and that is well below the levels that have been achieved historically. So we feel the 40% is very achievable based on historic trends.
Thank you. Okay, we'll take 2 more points and then we'll probably end on this matter.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Just a quick one on that point just mentioned about reuse rates. The evidence base takes 2 figures, a short-term one and a longer-term one. The 40% figure is the short-term reuse rate between 2011 and 2015. And then there's another one between 2006 and 2015. It's a longer-term reuse rate, and that's 34%. And there doesn't seem to be in the evidence any indication as to why they've chosen 40 over 34 and why the reuse rates would obviously be more akin to the short-term one or the long-term one. It seems to me that it might just as likely be 34% as 40.
If I just take you to, for your notes, EB 610, page 46, which is in the appendices, figure A 3.6, which has the data that my colleague's referring to in terms of the different percentages, 34% and 40%. In some ways, the percentages are somewhat misleading, which is why Mr. Coleman shared the the absolute figure of 2,790. That compares to a short-term historic trend of 4,770. and a long-term trend of 6,580. So whilst the percentage might be at the higher end of the scale, in absolute terms, we think it's very realistic and reasonable.
Thank you. Last comment from Mr. Pastel.
Thank you. Just something I think we need to be quite clear about. The council is telling us that we have new land being allocated in the plan, but actually when you hunt through the documents and the evidence base, there are no new jobs. This is not new land. It is almost, for industrial and warehousing, it is 100% replacement floor space. So there is no job growth in this plan for industrial or warehousing, which, given we're about to get a new next warehouse imminently, is clearly not sensible or plausible. So planning on a nil net job growth is not in the spirit of the PPG, nor is it actually in accordance with the actual evidence trail. Now, when you go out to do your site visits, we've heard that past trends have been taken into account, which I totally disagree with. I can't see how they could have been. But when you do go out and do your site visits and look at the Waltham Abbey site, where Next now have got their pre-let, next door to that site there is a very big Sainsbury's distribution warehouse that was only opened 13, 14 years ago, so well within a planned period that we're talking about here, and we're not actually making any provision for new warehouses once this next site has gone. So when you look at the actual realities on the ground, past trends analysis would strongly suggest that there is a higher demand for land in this part of the world than the council's made any provision for. And finally, part of the point we said about the FEMA, part of the risk of inappropriately defining your FEMA is that you don't actually capture full market demand for uses. And warehousing and logistics has a very wide area of search, far bigger than a single district and far bigger than this single district. But because the FEMA was defined so narrowly from an early stage, there's been no real consideration of regional warehousing demand, sub-regional warehousing demand. And we know from the GLA's evidence base, the London Industrial Land Study, that there is footloose warehousing and logistics demand being pushed out of London that the boroughs cannot take.
Thank you, Madam. Just to come back very briefly on what Mr. Pestel said, he's correct that there is a live planning application on site WAL.E8. It's not yet determined, and obviously from the council's point of view that's positive in sense of one of the allocations coming forward for delivery. There are other sites in the plan, as I've explained, table 3.1 sets those out. Importantly, one of those sites is NWB.E4, which is Northfield Airfield, which is under the ownership of the council and is one of the areas that will be subject to a strategic master plan and has considerable opportunities for future employment development. So I don't necessarily agree with the fact that there are no new employment sites in the plan. And as I've also alluded to, there are other, beyond the actual allocations, there are opportunities for other employment sites to come forward within other master plan areas. They're just not quantified at this stage because it's unclear at this moment exactly what they might be. They're not intended to be large scale, but obviously there are opportunities there in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll leave the discussion there, but I first of all just wanted, as I must raise them, accepting that for now you don't agree with the figures. Obviously, I need to give some consideration to the figures, but in terms of the main modifications that the council has proposed through its statement, one of them is a modification to SP2E to clarify that 10,800 jobs should be made over the plan period 11 to 33. One question I have was, should it also state any of the floor space requirements?
I think it does include the land requirement already.
Okay.
Which, if it does, I think that should be sufficient.
Okay. Yep. Okay. It does. You're right. Yep. And there was also a modification proposed to table 2.5, page 30. It's intended to show the employment land requirements for the period 2016 to 33, rather than 2011, is that right?
Yes, it's just a clarification on,
Yep.
on the time periods.
Okay. And the council proposes modifications to this table and to the supporting text in 2.71 to clarify this. And also to clarify that the 14 hectares of land is for industrial and not office purposes. So obviously accepting that you obviously dispute the figures, those are the modifications would be proposed. Okay, thank you. Do people want a short break before we deal with the last issue? Yep. Okay, 4:10. Four. No participants. Are you leaving, Mr. Newton? You are? Okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay, yep. Okay, so issue 4 is the plan justified, effective and consistent with national policy in respect of the approach to meeting identified retail needs for development. So just to clarify the modifications, first of all, that are being proposed, we've explained that 59,700 square metres of retail floor space is needed during the period 2009 to 33, and you've explained in your statement why it's 2009. Taking account of development in the pipeline, 39,700 square metres is needed from 2016 to 33. That's correct. And you're proposing a modification to paragraph 3.53 to clarify this. Is that right? Okay. Correct? Good. There won't be any comments, so we'll move on. Okay, could you just explain to me the nature of the pipeline development and how certain are you that it will come forward during the plan period? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. Yes, the council references pipeline of some 20,000 square metres within paragraph 47 of our matter statement, and highlights that further detail is set out in section 3.3 of the Town Centres Review, which is EB 1008. In terms of what constitutes that pipeline, the pipeline includes the retail park at Langston Road, for which planning permission was granted in 2012 for the development of nearly 16,500 square metres, which is predominantly retail. That's now developed and open. It's known as Epping Forest Shopping Park. That was opened in 2017. I can give you the application reference number if that's helpful.
That's done, is it? It's developed and open,
Yeah.
2017. Okay. Where did you? It was the retail park at where? Did you say?
It's Langston Road
Langston Road.
in Loughton.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Okay.
Loughton Debton.
Okay, thank you.
In addition, pipeline also includes development at the St John's Road Opportunity Area in Epping. And that's an allocation within the plan, EPP.R4. The council is the landowner, or is the landowner of a significant element of the site, and a revised scheme is currently being put forward in accordance with an adopted development brief, which is EB 1000. And the scheme will include a mix of uses, including retail. In addition, a small number of other schemes have come forward or are coming forward. For instance, there are 3 units of A1 to A3 class uses being delivered through the redevelopment of a pub site in Loughton Broadway. I can give you the reference if that's helpful.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. The next question was whether it's justified to rely upon Harlow to deliver 40% of the remaining 39,700 required. You've referred to policy, if we just turn to your statement. Okay, so you've referred to policy RS2 of the emerging local plan, which obviously now submitted for examination. And that sets out the scale of comparison and convenience floor space being planned for there. Is it clear that the figures you've quoted up to 2026 and beyond, if they specifically include an allowance for the needs identified in Epping Forest rather than just within Harlow itself?
Sorry, the figures in our plan or in Harlow's plan?
In Harlow's plan.
I'm not sure off the top of my head. I think we can check that, but I don't think it's explicit in their plan.
I suppose the certainty I'm seeking is that you're saying that 40% is going to be delivered in Harlow. How do you know that? Yeah.
So I think it's come from the town centre study report, which looks at the amount of floor space per settlement in the district, and it acknowledges that Harlow is a major settlement just outside the district, but one that will have a significant pull in terms of the town centre. Sorry, table 10 in the town centre's review, which is EB 1008. So that's table 10, and that's on page 22. Provides a breakdown of the likely modelled provision within different settlements, including in Harlow. It's also considered that of that 40%, that will be provided through a mixture of space within the garden town sites that are within Epping Forest district, but on the edge of Harlow, and within Harlow town centre. So we feel it's justified, but also that it's a very reasonable assumption in terms of the reality is that Harlow will be providing for a significant amount of growth, and that's their aspiration to do so. Particularly through their area action plan, which they're developing for the town centre. So the plans do align in that respect.
Thank you. Okay then, last question. This says whether it's justified to rely upon policy E2 and the residential-led allocations that you've mentioned to deliver the remaining 23,800-ish floor space requirements in Epping Forest. I would have asked any others who remained here whether or not, I've read your point about whether it's consistent with national policy. I mean, it's not perhaps consistent with the letter of national policy, but perhaps you can just explain that approach.
Yeah, sure. I mean, as you say, it is largely set out in our meta statement, but the residual requirement, 23,800 odd square metres, is not considered to be significant in the great scheme of things. And actually that amount can be distributed across the higher order settlements within the district, we think relatively easily. So the same table I referred you to under your previous question sets out that distribution across the different settlements. Importantly, the policy approach as well within the plan includes a commitment to the retail function of the 2 town centres and the 4 small district centres. That's within the respective visions for those settlements and the place-specific policies. And in addition, the larger residential-led developments where strategic master plans are being produced, will be required to make provision above and beyond. Similarly to employment uses, the quantity is not specified, but there will be local centres and there will be an element of retail use.
Okay, on that point, this is my last question. I was wondering, you're not relying on specific strategic allocations, or if you are, will the relevant policies be effective in securing it? So, for example, policy P2 on Loughton and P3 on Waltham Abbey, they don't make any specific reference to new retail development, as far as I could see.
I think we've specified provision where we think it's likely to come forward. So the policies do set out where it's required, and importantly, Appendix 6 to the local plan submission version also sets out where retail uses should come forward as part of other developments, smaller developments across the district. So
Right.
it is specified a mixture between the policies themselves and Appendix 6 for the site-specific requirements.
Okay, so you're not concerned that there's any omission? For example, I looked at the Waltham Abbey master plan area, because I think in one of the other master plan areas it does mention small-scale retail, but in this one it just says a new local centre and community facility. It doesn't mention there being any requirements for retail.
Well, I think you're correct. I think we have actually proposed a modification. We'll just find the reference for you, just to confirm that. I think that was an error. So it's in paragraph 58 of our matter statement. We propose to amend policy P3 for Waltham Abbey North Master Plan to include reference to provision of retail. So you're quite correct, that was an error, but we feel that rectifies the situation.
Might it be possible for you just to draw together for me in a table which sites or allocations are expected to make some provision for retail, just so I can see it, and then that will cover?
Absolutely, no, that's absolutely fine.
Thank you.
We can also supply you with the Harlow policy and the supporting justification text, if that would be helpful. So hopefully you can see how it, whilst it doesn't, I don't think it does make specific reference, but it ties in with the overall approach that we're promoting.
Okay.
For example, it does mention that the future new provision of retail, future new retail provision will serve the garden town communities at a local level. So that's obviously relevant.
Yeah. Thank you. So if you could do that, so that would be useful. I don't have anything further. Just to wrap up a few things that we've asked about. So obviously there's that note and Harlow's policy, and I think there were 3 other things. They're coming today.
At least 2 of them are coming Tuesday. The rest will come to the program officer within the next 24 hours.
That's fine. Okay, thank you. Thank you. One thing I mentioned to the programme officer just before we came in, it's something that had occurred to me, the matter for you to decide, but in terms of notifying people of hearing sessions, the additional hearing session in May might not have been advertised. I just wonder if it would be worth covering that. Okay, that's it. Thank you. Thank you very much. So we'll see you again a week on Monday. Thank you. Thanks very much for your contributions. Thank you.